Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
Today we're diving into a story that, well, it either terrifies people or it completely liberates them.
I want you to just imagine this for a second. You're not just a guy who goes to church on Sunday. You are a professional Christian. Your career, your friendships, your marriage, your entire view of the universe is built on this one single mission: evangelizing the world. You are absolutely 100% certain you have the capital T truth.
And then you pull one single loose thread, a question about, of all things, biology, and the whole thing starts to unravel.
We are looking at the deconstruction of Rhett McLaughlin.
Yeah, you probably know him from Good Mythical Morning. But this is not a YouTuber gossip story. This is a really rigorous case study of what happens when God has a plan for your life, smacks right into the hard questions of science and history and morality.
We're going to trace that path from total fundamentalist certainty all the way to a place of comfortable mystery.
It's quite a journey. And to get it, I think we have to start with the context. Rhett wasn't just like a casual believer. He was all in.
All in is an understatement.
It really is. Before YouTube, Rhett and his partner, Link, were on staff for Cru. That's Campus Crusade for Christ. And Cru is not a social club, It's a mission organization. Their whole philosophy was win, build, send.
That sounds almost like a military strategy.
Well, it effectively is, just, for spiritual warfare. You win students to Christ, you build them up in the faith, and then you send them out to go and do the exact same thing.
And he wasn't doing this in some comfy church basement. He talks about being on mission at Panama City Beach during spring break.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, man. So you've got thousands of college kids, solo cups, just chaos. And here comes Rhett trying to save their souls.
Exactly. It sounds incredibly awkward, and he says it was. But he talks about this fascinating psychological insight he had. He realized that maybe 3 or 4 days into a bender, there's this specific morning after moment of vulnerability. The adrenaline is gone, the hangover is real, and people just feel empty. And he was trained to step right into that exact moment of emptiness and just drop the hammer.
What does that even mean? What's the hammer?
He'd ask, if you died tonight, how certain are you that you would go to heaven?
Wow. That's intense. But I guess it worked.
It worked because Rhett absolutely believed it. He had what he calls certainty. He describes lying in bed at night, just staring at the ceiling and literally thanking God that out of all the billions of people and thousands of religions on earth, he was lucky enough to be born into the exact right one.
It must be a very comforting feeling to think you have the answer key to the universe.
It is, but it's also incredibly fragile. We came across this idea in our research called the preface paradox, and it just explains Rhett's mindset perfectly.
Okay, what is that? The preface paradox?
So imagine you write this huge book about everything you believe. If I asked you to go through it page by page, you'd say, yep, page 1 is true, page 2, that's true. You do it for the whole book. But then, if I asked you, statistically, is there at least one tiny error somewhere in this whole book? You'd have to say, well, I'm human, so probably yes.
Right. It's almost impossible to be 100% right about everything.
Exactly. But the kind of fundamentalism Rhett was in doesn't allow for that. The whole system has to be totally inerrant. If one page is wrong, the whole book might be wrong. So you have to defend every single sentence with your life.
Which is why he was arguing about things he didn't even understand. He admits he used to debate evolution with, total confidence, even though he'd never actually studied it.
He called it the cult of certainty. He would use these little gotcha questions. He'd ask a skeptic, give me one example of a beneficial mutation. And if the person stumbled or couldn't answer immediately, Rhett would just sort of smirk. He thought he was winning.
He was just winning by being the loudest guy in the room.
Right. But eventually that noise dies down.
Yeah.
And the usual story here is, the good Christian kid moves to Hollywood and gets corrupted.
Right. By the sinful liberal.
But Rhett makes this very specific point. His deconstruction did not start in L.A. The very first domino fell when he was still living deep in the Bible Belt, in North Carolina.
And it started with a book that was supposed to make his faith stronger, right?
Correct. He picked up a book by an astronomer named Hugh Ross. Now, Ross is a Christian, but he's a progressive creationist. He looks at the stars, he looks at the science, and he has to admit, the universe is billions of years old. The literal 6-day creation story in Genesis. It just can't be scientifically true.
Okay, so he's on board with the timeline, but he still doesn't accept evolution.
Nope. Ross argues that even though the Earth is old, God still intervened and created every species individually, by hand. He says God created these batches of animals. He'd make a batch, they'd go extinct, and then he'd make a new batch that looked a little more like humans.
Wait, hold on. If God is making batches and
Yeah.
prototypes, that sort of implies he doesn't know the final outcome. That feels like a huge demotion from an all-knowing creator.
That was the exact problem for Rhett. Hugh Ross's theory, it solves the age of the Earth problem, but it creates a divine competence problem.
Right.
Rhett looked at the fossil record, which is full of extinction and mistakes and dead ends, and Ross was telling him, God did all that on purpose. He made those specific animals, watched them all die, and then made slightly better ones.
It turns God into, like, a software engineer who keeps having to release patches. Whoops, the dinosaur update crashed. Let's try mammals.
It felt messy. It felt arbitrary. Rhett literally thought, this explanation is actually harder for me to believe than evolution.
Huh.
Evolution is this elegant, self-correcting process. Ross's theory made God seem like a bad engineer, and once that door was cracked open, Rhett decided to actually look at the science. He read The Language of God by Francis Collins.
Who is a huge deal,
Right?
led the Human Genome Project.
And a devout Christian. But Collins didn't pull any punches on the science. He presented the genetic evidence, specifically something called retroviral markers.
Okay, you're going to have to break that down for me. Retroviral markers.
Think of it like a scar in your DNA. If a virus infects a creature, it can leave a specific mark in a specific location on the genetic code.
Okay.
And if that creature has babies, they inherit the scar. Collins pointed out that humans and chimpanzees share the exact same viral scars in the exact same places all over our DNA.
And the odds of that happening just by chance are?
Basically zero. It's statistical proof that we share a common ancestor.
Hmm.
For Rhett, a guy who really values logic, this was the smoking gun. It was over. Evolution is true.
This wasn't a cool science fact moment for him. This was a tragedy.
A complete tragedy because of that preface paradox we talked about. If Genesis is wrong about the how, maybe it's wrong about the who. He describes telling his wife, Jessie, who was also a very devout believer, he said, I think evolution is real, and she just started weeping.
She wasn't crying about monkeys.
No. She was crying because she felt the foundation of their entire life, their marriage, their eternity, just cracking beneath their feet.
That is the terror of it, isn't it? It's not just changing your mind, it's losing your whole world. So Rhett has to find a new way to figure out what's true.
And this is where the big shift in epistemology happens. That's how we know what we know. Rhett realized he had been trained in apologetics, but what he needed to be doing was scholarship.
I think for a lot of us, those words sound like the same thing. You're just studying the Bible.
They're actually complete opposites. The best way to think about it is the difference between a detective and a defense attorney.
Okay, I like that.
A detective shows up to a crime scene and asks, what happened here? They follow the evidence wherever it leads. That's critical scholarship.
So the apologist is the attorney.
The apologist is the defense attorney. They already have a client. The Bible is true. Their job isn't to find the truth. Their job is to get an acquittal, no matter what the evidence says. Discredit the witness, explain away the fingerprint.
So Rhett realizes he's been trained to be a lawyer for God, but he actually wants to be a detective for the truth.
Exactly. He realized apologists were often arguing in bad faith. They weren't trying to find truth. They were trying to protect dogma. And once he started thinking like a detective, he ran straight into a moral brick wall.
The asshole question.
That's what he calls it, yeah. It's the problem of hell and predestination. See, the theology he was in believed that God preordains everything.
Meaning God chooses who goes to heaven and who doesn't, before they're even born.
Yes. And since Rhett also believed most people are going to hell, the math was just horrifying. It meant God creates billions of people with the specific, pre-planned intention of torturing them forever.
It makes God the villain of his own story.
Rhett just couldn't square a good father with a God who sets up a system where 99% of his kids are doomed from the start. And when he'd ask his friends about it, they'd just say, who are you to question God? His ways are higher than our ways.
Which is really just a fancy way of saying, stop thinking about it.
But he couldn't stop. Still, even with evolution and the morality of hell, he had one last firewall. The one thing that, if true, kept him in the Christian camp.
The resurrection.
Right. He thought, okay, maybe Genesis is a myth, maybe the theology's a mess, but if Jesus of Nazareth physically walked out of a tomb, then I'm still a Christian. I could figure out the rest later.
That's the linchpin, isn't it? If the resurrection happened, the game is still on.
So Detective Rhett went to work. He stopped reading books about the Bible and started reading the actual history of the Bible. And he started finding things that apologists tend to gloss over.
Like the empty tomb.
Well, specifically, he realized the story of the empty tomb might be a literary invention. If you want to claim a bodily resurrection, you have to account for the body. The tomb has to be empty. Otherwise, people would just say, guys, his body's right there.
So it's like a necessary plot device for the story to even work.
Right. But the thing that really, really shook him, and I think this surprises most people, was the zombies in the Gospel of Matthew.
Wait, back up. Zombies? I went to Sunday school. I know about the earthquake, the curtain tearing in the temple. I have never heard about zombies walking around Jerusalem.
Most pastors just skip right over that verse, honestly. It's in Matthew 27. It says, when Jesus died, the tombs broke open, and many holy people were raised to life. And then, and this is the key part, they went into Jerusalem and appeared to many people.
Okay, hold on. If dead people are crawling out of their graves and walking through the city market, that is the headline of the century.
You would think so, and that was Rhett's point. We have historians from that time, Josephus, Tacitus. These are guys who recorded every weird rumor and uprising in Jerusalem. Not a single one of them mentions a zombie apocalypse on Passover.
So it's only in Matthew?
Only in Matthew. Not even the other gospel writers mention it. Think about that. Mark, Luke, and John are writing the story of Jesus' life, and they just forgot to include the part about the army of walking dead saints.
That makes no sense.
It doesn't. And Rhett realized it was a legend. Matthew probably included it to add some, special effects to the crucifixion to show how important it was. But if Matthew was willing to invent zombies to make a theological point, how can we trust him when he talks about the guards at the tomb? Or the angel?
The witness is compromised. If he's making up the zombies, he's probably embellishing the resurrection too.
That was the final domino. Rhett concluded the resurrection cannot be historically proven. It is far, far more likely that it was a spiritual experience that grew into a legend over many decades. And once the resurrection was gone, the lights went out.
That sounds like a terrifying place to be. He talks about realizing he didn't even know how Jesus died or where he was buried, that his personal relationship with God was just him talking to himself in the car.
It's a profound loss. But this is where the story pivots. Because Rhett didn't become a nihilist. He didn't become some angry atheist. He moved to LA, got some space, and he landed in a place he calls hopeful agnosticism.
And he has this analogy about a magic show that I just love.
It's brilliant. He says his worldview now is like being at a magic show. On stage is the magician. The magician is mystery, God, awe, all the stuff we can't explain.
And sitting next to you is the guy explaining the trick.
Right. And that guy is science, logic, evolution. Now, Rhett wants to listen to that guy. He wants to know how the trick works. He wants to understand reality.
But, and this is the really important part, he doesn't want the explainer to ruin the entire show.
Exactly. He hopes there is still one trick at the end the guy can't explain. He calls God the blanket we throw over the mystery. He isn't saying there is no God. He is hoping that at the very bottom of it all, there's still something magical that science can't touch.
It's a really humble position. It's not, I know God doesn't exist. It's, I don't know, but I hope.
And weirdly, this new position has actually made him very protective of Jesus.
Protective. But he doesn't think Jesus is God anymore.
No, but he believes in the character of Jesus. He talks about seeing modern Christian nationalism. He specifically mentions the movement around Donald Trump and just seeing this profound irony.
The irony that the people who are shouting Jesus' name the loudest are supporting things that seem, well, very un-Jesus-like.
Rhett points out that historical Jesus preached meekness, charity, love for the outcast. And then he sees politicians using Christianity as a crude tool for power, for wealth, for exclusion. And even as an agnostic, he feels this need to defend the reputation of Jesus from the church.
That's a fascinating twist. The agnostic defending the teachings of Christ from the Christians.
It really shows you can lose the dogma but hold on to the values. Rhett's deconstruction wasn't about wanting to sin. He didn't leave the church so he could go party. He left it because he cared more about truth than he did about being right.
It's that shift from valuing certainty to valuing curiosity.
Yeah. When he was a missionary, his whole identity was, I have the answer.
Yeah.
Now his identity is, I'm exploring the question. And that might be a much more spiritual place to be.
Which brings us back to that idea of the blanket over the mystery. Rhett used to believe God was the answer to every question. Now God is the name for the things we just haven't figured out yet.
And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. If human progress is just us slowly, piece by piece, peeling back that blanket, explaining the lightning, explaining disease, explaining the stars. Does God eventually just disappear completely? Or does the mystery just keep changing shape?
And if we ever do figure it all out, will we miss the magic?
I think we might.
Thanks for thinking deeper with us.